Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Yes, it's a very relevant topic that brings us all together here. So I'm very happy to, and really honored to be moderating this panel. I'm Emilia Reyes. I'm coming from a feminist Mexican organization called Equidad de Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo y Familia. We're really happy to be joining CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law, in organizing this event, especially with a new report on climate and racial justice that was just drafted by the UN Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, Madam Tendai Achiume. The report was just released like a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you've read it. It's brutal. It's massively brutal. And it brings us all together precisely in a thorough recognition of all that has been missing in our analysis and all that has been missing in our proposals. But also, the report lays out a wider conversation that is not only challenging the situation that is lived at the community level or at the national level, but really even perhaps bringing solutions not only to discussions that are happening here in the UNFCCC space, but also globally within the economic and financial architecture as a whole. So it is really, really relevant in the context that brings us all together tonight. So we're going to have a side event of about an hour. We're going to be watching a video of the rapporteur presenting to us the main findings, and then we're going to hear a reaction and then accounts from the community level about the realities that the rapporteur is portraying in her report. So without further ado, I think we can go ahead and see the video and then coming back to the reactions. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you to CIEL for the invitation to participate in this side event, and even more so for their tireless work on the themes at the center of the report that I'm going to be discussing today. My report, which is entitled Ecological Crisis, Climate Justice and Racial Justice, was my final report as Special Rapporteur, so I should begin by noting that I'm addressing you in my capacity as the former Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. I find in my work that it's always helpful to begin a discussion like this with a very brief reminder of what race is, and in particular what race does as well. There can be a way of thinking and talking about race that keeps it at the level of an individual basis of identifying, when in fact the history of race and the way that it functions globally today is anchored in European colonialism. And we know that European colonialism consolidated race and racial identity as the fundamental criteria for the distribution of the world into ranks, places, and rules. And these are points that decolonial scholars and activists have long made. And notwithstanding the fact that in much of the world we've had formal decolonization, and it's not as though every part of the world is decolonized, the reality is that race and ethnicity continue to play this discriminatory role. And I might encourage you to think of, for a moment, the disparate racial national impact of COVID-19, for example. It remains the case that race and ethnicity continue to determine enjoyment of fundamental human rights, and it's the structural effect that we're concerned with when we speak of systemic racism. Nothing arguably forces us to confront the racial and ethnic and national hierarchies that are embedded in the global economy and in the global order more broadly than the global ecological crisis. I received many submissions from many experts who summarized a rich body of research that charts the racist and colonial regimes that underpin the extraction of coal, of gas, and of oil, and that forged a global capitalist system that remains dependent on maintaining racial hierarchies. And these hierarchies are at the heart of the global ecological crisis. By way of background, in 2019 I produced a report on global extractivism, which also highlighted the racist colonial foundations of the extractivist and industrialization processes that have caused the global ecological crisis. And that report also addressed how that history continues to shape the present. And I highlight that report because even though COP27 focuses on the climate crisis, we have to really think about the foundations of that crisis in a broader relationship of extraction and exploitation that includes thinking specifically about themes that we may not immediately associate with climate. The global ecological crisis, which includes the climate crisis, is among other things a racial justice crisis. And there can be no meaningful mitigation or undoing of ecological disaster without effective action to address the systemic racism at its core, and in particular the historical and contemporary legacies of colonialism and slavery. And this is the fundamental insight of the report, or the fundamental call of the report, is to say that there cannot be climate justice or a resolution to environmental degradation and ecological disaster without really taking seriously systemic racism. One of the main ambitions that I had for this report was just to amplify the truths that racially, ethnically, and nationally marginalized groups have been fighting to have centered in international and national responses to global ecological crisis. So I'll say, please read the report, because my remarks today cannot do justice to the inputs that are reflected in that report. I want to just share some highlights or findings that give you a sense of what's covered in the report. The first has to do with what I term racial sacrifice zones. So we hear a lot about sacrifice zones, which are regions that are rendered dangerous and even uninhabitable due to environmental degradation. These sacrifice zones are more aptly termed racial sacrifice zones, and they are concentrated in the formerly colonized territories of the Global South. This concentration is not by accident. The extractive and genocidal processes at the core of colonialism are a big part of this reason, and these processes that led to historic emissions, these historic emissions have fueled the climate crisis that we are currently confronting. The report notes that racial sacrifice zones also include the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples, the territories of small island developing states, racially segregated neighborhoods in the global north, and occupied territories, including the occupied Palestinian territories facing drought and environmental devastation. The primary beneficiaries of these racial sacrifice zones we have to highlight include the transnational corporations that continue to funnel wealth towards the global north and towards privileged national and local elites all over the world. In addition to documenting racial sacrifice zones, the report highlights coerced displacement and immobility in the context of ecological crisis, and it focuses on how racially, ethnically, and nationally marginalized groups are disparately subject to this coercion and immobility. The submissions that I received show how climate-induced migration cannot be divorced from the racially unjust hierarchies and regimes of colonial and imperial extraction and exploitation that have significantly determined who is forced to move and who has the privilege of keeping their homes today. There's a human rights framework that, even in the present, requires UN member states to take action against environmental racism, and the report highlights this human rights framework. This human rights framework requires greater attention and greater commitment, including from environmental and climate advocates who are driving mitigation and other strategies related to addressing the fallout of ecological crisis. But as I highlight in the report, the human rights framework alone cannot mitigate or undo the racial injustices, including the racially discriminatory impacts of the global ecological crisis. In fact, as highlighted by many of the analyses that I received in preparing this report, a central problem is the existing international legal frameworks. For example, in addition to some of the factors that I've mentioned already, international law fails to provide robust provisions for holding transnational corporations accountable for human rights violations that disproportionately affect peoples and territories colonially designated as non-white. International investment law presently serves as a deterrent to environmentally responsible extractivism regulation because of the costly arbitrary proceedings and others that can result from national, environmental, and other regulation that diminishes the value of foreign investment. My report highlights a number of other ways in which the current approaches, including the current legal frameworks, are not going to be sufficient to address the problems of climate justice and of racial injustice at the center of climate injustice. Within the broader movement for environmental justice, climate justice seeks historical accountability from those nations and entities that are responsible for climate change. Climate justice also seeks radical transformation of the contemporary system that enabled global ecological crisis and that distributes the suffering today on a racially discriminatory basis. There's a long analysis within the report on why historic emissions remain a contemporary problem today and why the past is not the past. And I provide a number of examples of how the past continued to shape who is suffering today. But what you see is that both within and outside the United Nations, member states are championing initiatives to develop responses to the global ecological crisis that completely neglect racial justice, and yet a racial justice approach is urgent. The framing of climate change within the global governance regimes really elides the historical responsibility borne by some states and transnational corporations. Questions of reparation and remediation for loss and damage caused by climate change and environmental degradation have purposefully been excluded from the relevant frameworks by powerful countries. The eventual inclusion of loss and damage within the Paris Agreement was due to a compromise that continues to shield wealthy nations from accountability. As such, the trajectory of the loss and damage framework after the Paris Agreement has continued its transition away from confronting historical responsibility and reparation. And all we are waiting to see is whether COP27 holds different possibilities. In my report, I include several recommendations, but I want to conclude because of time constraints by highlighting only the following. In the report, I call on UN member states to adopt a global approach that effectively responds to the fact that climate justice requires racial justice, and that racial justice itself requires climate justice. The racially disparate impacts of environmental degradation, of climate injustice, require fundamental reorientation of political institutions, economic systems, and legal principles that include racial justice and equality priorities. Green transitions must also be racially just transitions. And true racial justice entails an end to environmental racism and also entails adaptation, mitigation, and a mitigation and loss and damage framework that uproots the systemic racism built into the global economy, and that also uproots political hierarchies in the legal frameworks as well. And really what I'm calling for here is a wholesale decolonization of the legal and economic systems in place in order to ensure that racially marginalized groups, including indigenous peoples, possess true self-determination, including sovereignty over their territories. Climate reparations are required now, and they require addressing both historic climate injustice as well as eradicating the contemporary systemic racism that continues to shape who is impacted most severely by the global ecological crisis. I have no doubt that the conversation and other panelists who will be presenting today will really unpack some of the themes that I've gestured at, and I could not encourage you more to read the report. And want to conclude, I suppose, by just thanking those of you in the audience who are really doing the hard work of ensuring that racial justice remains at the center of the fight for climate justice as well as environmental justice as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. As I said, the report is really comprehensive. I think the role of the moderators is to shut up and give the floor to either the audience or the panelists. So I'm just going to turn to our colleague Mishi Zingano from WIDU to give us a reaction from the African feminist perspective, and what are the implications on global governance on what Madam Achiume was telling us in the video and in the report. Thank you, Mishi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, moderator. And I think as African feminists, I should really start this conversation by thanking the former rapporteur now for sharing this brutal report which captured the tragedy around race, because this is really a tragedy. And I think my sincere gratitude is how she captured it, because she captured it in a way that can be understood, right? It's really easy to comprehend what has been said. And I feel strongly now after this report, which I also encourage all of you to read, there will be no longer excuses and more excuses of lack of knowledge on the intersectionality between race and climate justice, because this knowledge has been provided. And significantly, I feel this will also address what has been my puzzle all along growing up, because for so long we have been sold the might and the supremacy of whiteness as is all-knowing, is all-powerful. But in the same way, we've been told that this whiteness lacks comprehension to comprehend some basic concept like racism. So I feel strongly that this dilemma will be solved, because we have managed, this report has managed to really bring down to the level of comprehension that I think those who qualify themselves to be called racist can comprehend and can address it. Some of the things that I have noted on the report, I think it has been said, but it's worth emphasizing, is how structural race is. And as a concept, like sometimes you look at it as a concept, but how structural in terms of how it shapes people's lives, how it shapes people's destiny. We live in a world that we are condemning people for the circumstances of their birth, because when I was born, I didn't have a choice whether I should come pink, blue, white, or green. But we have created a world that the circumstance of your birth dictate who you can and you cannot be, who you should and you should not be, and the circumstances of which your life and choices will be confined to. And I think it's just about time that all of us really address that question. And speaking as a woman who carried blackness, I think this report reminded me what has been institutionalized, that growing up you know that power is white. You know that money is white. You know that knowledge is white. And you know that wisdom is white. We are here in the conferences in the room of negotiation. We have seen that played every day, every single minute. Because some races have experience to share or life story to tell, but other races have knowledge, have power, have empirical evidences. And that is part of the structural problem which is embedded in the conversation around race. I think that report again shows what needs to change within these spaces, because it's about time that shouldn't look at one race as only a case study, a testimonies to the catastrophes that are facing, without even taking into the consideration why is the same race that are always paraded as a case study, not the other race? Because at least with that parading, we should have captured it, that there is a fundamental problem on race, and that's why we are parading one race as a case study. So again, I strongly recommend everyone reading this report, and I also recommend and endorse all that has been shared as recommendations. And specifically, she did mention one of the recommendations that I think has not been captured in the video is the recommendation on meaningful engagement in the representation, especially of those community, but more importantly, right to development. Right to development in the pace and time and ideology of the people. not us setting standard of how development should be. Because we live in the world that addressing climate change, we are shifting what we think is our standards of development. What is our idea of development? We have seen how overconsumption model have been shifted in as the model that developed countries or certain races has to replicate. And lastly, it has been said in the report, and I think it's worth mentioning now, that some, or I might dare say, most of what is called the green solution, they're just a white solution. And it's about time that we call them for what they are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mishi. That was really powerful, and I really like the thing that their green solutions are white solutions, but because they only solve whatever it is in the white people's interest. And I just want to highlight that the report goes back into calling how historical and differential responsibilities have been agreed by the white developed countries, but only to interpret it as if they have a larger capacity and power, and not in the sense of their historical responsibility that we understand that they should be held accountable. And that is a striking note, because that does represent the way the wealthy countries are behaving in these spaces, protecting their own interests. And just to highlight, and going to the panel, that Madam Achiume also talks about these racial sacrifice zones that are coming as a result of many of the, on the one hand, the actions of the economic system, but second also as the solutions that have been posed here in the UNFCCC. So Madam Achiume really directly talks about the false solutions. So we want to ask first, Madam Panganga Pungowiji, who's coming from the Indigenous Environment Network. Apologies, and please remind us how to pronounce your name. What are the perspectives of those so-called solutions, but in the end are bringing projects such as geoengineering or carbon capture and storage? And what are the disproportionate impacts on indigenous peoples and communities that have been historically marginalized? And specifically, how do these false solutions relate to these racial sacrifice zones that we see in the report? Thank you so much for being here. You have the floor.
So, huanga atka bangangang ng naka bangawi, huanga ataka akanaterma naka Kirsten Nugak Pas, huanga sivunga kami. I come from St. Lawrence Island, and we on St. Lawrence Island are sometimes referred to as the most polluted people in the world. We are highly contaminated both by a history of experiments with radioactive iodine injections and by an intentional chemical and fuel spill by the military on our Northeast Cape. Additionally, all world toxics travel north by current, and we are one of 2 thoroughways to the Arctic. Our people have a long history of being both the stepping stool and the dumping ground of modern science and Western society. And so I am reminded of the words by my colleague, Aklasia Kamasuk, who says, as a society, we have forgotten how to be in relationship with one another. Indeed, colonization, patriarchy, white supremacy, militarism, capitalism, and an extraction-based economy have stolen this from us. All of these unnatural ways of being work together to sustain each other. How can we expect to ensure Earth is a safe place to live if we could continue to try to address the symptoms of climate change within the same value system that has caused it? Climate change solutions are not preventing sea ice loss or reflecting sunlight. We do not address climate change by treating our lands and waters as carbon sinks or building man-made structures to sequester carbon. These show that Western society and Western science narrowly focuses on the symptoms of climate change, leading to a cycle of running to the next emergency, attempting mitigation, not meeting the threshold, and starting all over again. Focusing on mitigation and not the root cause, like the burning of fossil fuels, is a deadly compromise we cannot afford. True and sustainable solutions do not lie in a university or a laboratory, but in relationship with your community, local organizations, and the indigenous peoples on whose lands you reside. Indigenous peoples have been in good relationship with the land for time immemorial and have managed to protect 80% of what is left of Earth's biodiversity. We try to share our wisdom in spaces that push false solutions, such as net zero emissions, nature-based solutions, geoengineering. A cap-and-trade market, carbon market that allows for carbon offsets leads to greenwash disaster capitalism. Indigenous peoples' bodies and homelands where these technologies are always tested are treated as sacrifice zones by Western science and its advanced technology, much in the colonial tradition and without free, prior, and informed consent. I will mainly touch on concerns about solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. But before I list the concerns, I want to preface it with a note that this is not engagement in an imagined debate that pro-geoengineering peoples and institutions believe they are in with indigenous peoples. This is an imbalanced, limited assertion stated within the confines of Western-defined time limit and structure. It is not an adequate platform to express our beliefs or cosmovision. So one of the projects that I want to talk about is Arctic Ice Project. Now this project was being tested outside of Utqagvik without free, prior, and informed consent. This initiative would spread white blood cell-sized synthetic silica hollow glass microspheres across 100,000 square kilometers of the Arctic ice. This would cost between $1 and $5 billion every year. So some of the health issues silica causes, in high doses causes kidney disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and when it's crushed and becomes crystalline, it can cause silicosis or tuberculosis. Marine mammals are a vital part of the living Arctic, and it is unknown how this would impact their bodies or their behavior and interaction with the ice. The winds in the Arctic would ensure these microspheres would not stay where intended. When the microspheres are broken, it is assumed they will fall to the ocean floor, and we're concerned about the reflective materials impacting deep ocean life and are concerned about them entering into the fish market. These concerns may or may not fall within the radar of those testing single-dimensional research areas like feasibility and short-term ingestion toxicity. But indigenous peoples of the Arctic recognize that these single-dimensional testing areas are inadequate. The living Arctic is a complex system made up of several interdependent living systems. The freeze and melt cycle of the ice is a vital part of that system. The living system within the ice depends on sunlight and the freeze-melt cycle in order to continue creating algae and sustain smaller life forms which are interdependent with larger life forms. ScopeX is a project that was going to be tested in Sweden on Sami territory without free, prior, and informed consent. Once the indigenous people found out, the Sami Council wrote an open letter to Harvard asking them to stop this testing on their lands. So the multi-million dollar computer programs that they use show that this will cause crop depletion. Oh, it's a form of stratospheric aerosol injection. So they want to inject sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to mimic a volcanic plume, which would cause crop depletion, disrupt precipitation, cause acid rain, drought, and kill an estimated approximate 5% of Earth's population. Major drought areas include the Amazon rainforest, where indigenous peoples live, and Southeast Asia. And once begun, application would need to happen continuously to avoid termination effect. Continual release of these aerosols have been shown by simulation to deplete the ozone in a matter of a half a century. These catastrophic concerns would be the culmination and combination of an uncountable smaller tragedies. So I talked about how the Sami Council wrote an open letter. So right now we've listened in on some conversations between Harvard and other geoengineers, and their argument against the Sami Council asking them to stop the testing is that it would be unethical for indigenous peoples to ask us to stop the testing because the Arctic is the most strategic location for that testing, and there is a global interest in geoengineering. So there's a lot of forms of carbon dioxide removal. We talked about carbon capture and storage. There's also bioenergy carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, and there's also ocean fertilization. So I don't know if I have a lot of time to get super into it, but I'll focus mostly on CCS. So it supposedly sucks carbon out at the source, condenses it into liquid form, and transfers it to a site to sequester it. Carbon is extremely corrosive, and it only takes a little moisture to eat away at the container it's sequestered in. And when it comes out, it expands into a gas. One such occurrence or accident happened in Mississippi in August 2021, and we have heard that people in the area continue to experience health impacts from the carbon monoxide exposure. Carbon sequestration is ineffective and a health hazard. The infrastructure needed for this techno-fix is not possible economically or physically, and no CCS project has ever met its targets, yet our governments and fossil fuel companies continue to invest because of carbon credits and net zero. 93% of the carbon captured in the US alone is used for enhanced oil recovery, where they flush out nearly depleted oil wells to get more oil faster. So I don't have too much time to share about the other carbon removal technologies, but there's BECCS, ocean fertilization, building underwater ice berms to block warm water from getting to ice sheets. But some of the concerns about these, they lead to agricultural imbalance, land rights issues, infrastructure leading to higher rates of missing and murdered indigenous women and relatives, and eco-disruption like ocean dead zones, and the tearing apart of biodiverse forests to make way for economically beneficial tree plantations on indigenous lands. So, of course, all the technologies that lead to carbon credits mean that fossil fuel companies increase their caps and governments meet net zero targets, while human rights violations by fossil fuel industry continue. It means there is increased cancer, lung disease, and accidents in communities who live near refineries, among other atrocities. The bottom line is that geoengineers and their pushers believe wholeheartedly that there is a global interest in geoengineering. In the neo-colonial tradition, much like a modern-day manifest destiny, they believe their values, knowledge, and experience overrule those of indigenous peoples on whose lands and waters they would like to proceed with testing and implementation. This flawed thinking is the same that has led us to where we are now. Geoengineering and its testing is unsafe, theoretical, diverts billions in resources from real solutions, and it is in direct conflict with indigenous values whose lands and ecosystems on which we depend to live on, and they will be most impacted. To test these technologies effectively, you would need to implement them. And implementing these technologies is a form of experimentation. Testing single-dimensional questions to address a problem that was identified with Western compartmentalized thinking and applying it to a complex global system is dangerous and will kill people. It is a violation of human rights to make the decision to do so for what one culture perceives to be the greater good. Indigenous peoples have the right to say what goes into our bodies, on our lands, in our air, even if Western standard testing deems those technologies safe. We must also consider the militarization of such technologies and the implications of how these would be applied in order to harm targeted populations. As an Indigenous femme, I understand that with new infrastructure always comes more missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. We must not assume that these would mitigate anything at all and consider that there would more likely be a compounding of negative impacts. When looking at climate policy, we must revisit the values which founded the creation and structure of the proposed policies. if we continue operating as though one value system and one way of being is the only standard in which to live, we will continually to struggle with our ability to thrive together on a livable and thriving Mother Earth. Keep it in the ground and let the Mother heal. She has shown us her power and ability to adjust herself. And during COVID, when emissions were reduced, the ozone repaired itself. Tribal sovereignty is what heals the climate. Indigenous rights heals the climate, and land back heals the climate.
Thank you so much, Madam Pungowiyi. I just want to highlight that in the report, the debate on the false solutions also are counterpointed with the need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, which is really the core of the debate. And also there is a paragraph where it states that while the implementation of the false solutions guarantee more capital, they also, during their implementation and in the phase of the project, the most impacted people are precise indigenous communities and marginalized communities, and this is why the racial sacrifice zones have expanded throughout the implementation of the measures that have been agreed here in the UNFCCC. And there is a disconnect between the solutions that we are making in relation to climate change as opposed to what are decisions that are being made in the Biodiversity Convention, and it seems like this disconnect is going to drive us to extinction in one way or another. So this is the wisdom that you're also sharing from the ground. And I just want to invite Mr. John Beer from Port Arthur Community Action Network to tell us precisely about the other side, which is precisely the impact created by the petrochemical industry and also generating these sacrifice zones, precisely impacting most the people who are in the frontline communities. So please go ahead, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I want to start out first by while I'm sitting up, lean into you and talk about this, because this is a conversation we have to have. It's important that we have it. And I'm going to preface what I want to say about the topic at hand by saying this. The Black author, writer, and activist W.B. Du Bois said that the question of America is the question of the color line. The United States Constitution says that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. Mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils, such as racism, are sufferable. In other words, we prefer the suffering from it than to actually find a cure or solution, or to do something different, or to change and modify one's behavior. I come from an area where basically the petrochemical industry started just a few miles from where I live in Port Arthur, at a little old place called Spindletop in 1901 when the Lucas Gusher came in. And 2 years later, in 1903, the first refineries were built, 3 of them. 2 in Port Arthur, one that was originally Gulf Oil Company, that's now Valero, one that was the Texas company, better known as Texaco, which is now Motiva, the largest refinery in the country. And the other was the company I worked for. Yes, I worked for 38 years in the petrochemical industry for ExxonMobil. At that time, it was Magnolia Oil, and then it became Mobil, and now it's ExxonMobil. And all of those were located in areas that originally were not identifiable by race. But here's what happened. Here's how that component moved over. Because a lot of the people that came, like my parents did, my mother from Southwest Louisiana and my father from East Texas, came to seek a better way of life, to get away from the farm and the hard scrabble life of having to earn your living from the ground, where you don't know from one day to the next whether your crops are going to survive or not. But they came to Port Arthur seeking fame and fortune, so to speak. And in coming there, a lot of times they didn't have places to stay, so the company built company towns just outside of the refinery gates so that people would have access to work. They didn't have to commute. They didn't have to go very far. They were right there. But then over time, you began to see the difference in what it did affecting the community. My parents used to tell me this, because, by the way, I was born and raised in the fence line community. I was less than 200 feet from the tank farm of what is now the largest refinery in the country. I could look out our kitchen window and 2 blocks away see another refinery, and then come out and sit on our front porch and look and see what's now the largest refinery in the country. So if you ever look at Port Arthur, Google Earth it, you'll see it's surrounded by refineries and tank farms and water. But going back to this story I'm telling you about how this happened, the people that were there largely were a mixture of folk, as the city is now, very diverse population of blacks, whites, and Hispanics. Now it's leaning more toward black and Hispanic and very few whites. But the whites that lived there had the opportunity to move elsewhere, and you want to know why? They were able to move away from living near the plant to other nicer places and communities away from it because they were paid more. My father told me the story of how they used to work for the great price of 35 cents an hour. But white men were earning 50 cents an hour, standing right next to you doing the same job. Well, and one has to understand this, that if you don't make enough money, or if my money is bigger than yours, as they say nowadays, then your house can't be as nice as mine, your car's not as nice as mine, the educational opportunities you can provide for your children are not going to be as good as mine. They're not going to have the opportunity to go to college or have you pay for it. So your quality of life is commensurate or conducive to the amount of money you make. So now we transferred this thing from being a simple racial thing, whereby you are paid less than a man doing the same job because of the color of your skin, to now having an economic component of economic discrimination. Because those same people, even when they were able to, and my dad was one of them, they had to file suit, and through their union were able to get equal pay for equal work across the board for the same position. Now that didn't stop a lot of the companies from doing things that were discriminatory. In my time coming through the plant, working for ExxonMobil, I knew of men who were doing first-class work as a machinist or a pipe fitter or a rigger, like Mr. Monroe. Mr. Monroe couldn't read his name in letters if they were big as this screen behind you. He wouldn't know it if you showed it to him. But he could do the work. And he could do the work so well that younger guys would come to him and ask him for advice on how to work or do a job, and he didn't have to go to the job to see it. He could tell you what different pieces of equipment you would need and what you would need and how long a cable or whatever you would have to do the work. But he wasn't getting first-class pay. He was getting basically what amounted to laborer's pay, several dollars an hour less. So we see the discrimination carrying over into that. And now the discrimination carries over into communities, because now those same communities which were along the fence line are now impacted by the flaring, the noise, the dust, and the emissions. You know, at the time, we didn't look at it that way. I remember my dad telling me many a day when we passed by the refinery and I would hold my nose because it smelled so bad. He said, son, don't turn up your nose at that. That's the smell of money. And it was for him, because it was a lot better than what he'd have made staying at home on the farm. So a lot of people gravitated to that to find a better way of life. But for some people, that way of life was not a dream, it was a nightmare, because they did not get the opportunities because of the color of their skin. They did not get equal pay because of the color of their skin. They did not get the opportunity to even advance in the company because of the color of their skin. So we see that racism carried out in many ways. And now what we see today, here's what Port Arthur and some of these communities look like. And my friend Roy Shetter can talk about that too in her hometown of Lake Charles, Louisiana. What those communities that are adjacent today to those refineries and places look like, they look like places we're seeing on the news every day in Ukraine, in Beirut. They look like third world countries because there are more vacant lots in Port Arthur. Go to my website for my organization, PACON, Port Arthur Community Action Network, and you'll see a video, an aerial video that shows more vacant lots in some parts of town than houses, damaged streets, homes that are substandard because of hurricanes that have hit. In the last 17 years, my city has been hit by 5 major hurricanes. And Rochetta had the problem of having 2 hit within 2 months of where she lives. And our towns and cities, because the people don't have the economic means, can't do well. They can't repair their homes. And some of them can't even get government assistance that's supposedly there to repair their homes. So all of this plays itself out in ways that hurt and affect the lives of everyday people. People who, for no cause of their own, are discriminated against because of the color of their skin. An artificial difference. You heard the lady on the video say earlier and talk to us about the fact that environmental justice is racial justice. And nothing, and it couldn't be said any plainer than that. Because the environmental degradation that goes on in these communities happen in communities of color, in indigenous communities of color, in communities that are black, brown, and BIPOC. Those are the communities that are impacted because those people had no choice and alternative but to be there. And they could not move elsewhere because they did not have the means. So generationally speaking, homes were passed on by father to son or daughter or the grandparents to their children. Those homes are still there, and those are the very homes today that have blue roofs on them because they were damaged by storms, some of which were 10, 15 years ago, but they could never be repaired. So what I'd like to do is challenge you all when we talk about this, as we lean in and talk and have these discussions, if you can, and if you're in the States, come by and visit Port Arthur, Texas, or come by and visit anywhere along the Gulf Coast in these coastal communities, and you will see the devastating effect. And then what you have to ask yourself is this: if the companies say they bring jobs and good fortune and improve the quality of life, what's happening in those BIPOC and indigenous communities? What's happening where the oil is extracted in those communities? What's happening where it's processed and then delivered to the world from those same communities? They don't share in that wealth. I'm going to tell you this story as I close that came to me from someone who worked in the petrochemical industry. They were the human resources manager for a Total refinery, which is owned by the French company, a French company. And she told me that one of her last acts of business before she retired was to hire 25 operators. So she went about putting ads in the paper, newspaper, TV, radio, all of that, and they had over 2,000 applicants. Of those 2,000 applicants, they selected 800 to test. Of those 800 that tested, they were going to select 150 to be interviewed, and then from that 150, select 25 who were going to be given the offer of employment. Would you like to guess how many of those 25 came from Port Arthur? 2. How do you change the complexion of a city that is economically disadvantaged, that has a high poverty rate of almost 30%, that 2/3 of a city of 57,000 are economically disadvantaged? That's a family of 4 living on less than $35,000 a year. How do you reconcile that? How do you fix that when they hire so few people to give them the means of lifting themselves up and getting out of that situation? But then what we notice is this, that with all of its economic development from petrochemicals, Port Arthur has one of the highest unemployment rates in the entire state. The only part of the state that's higher is down in the valley near Mexico, where they have no heavy industry at all. Their industry is tourism. So you can see the disparity of income and how it affects people and persons of color. That is economic injustice at its purest and finest. So what we hope for, what we work for, what those of you are here for, I'm hoping, as we lean into this and talk about it, is how are we going to have a more equitable, a more viable, and a more real future for those of us. If we get out of petrochemicals and fossil fuels, and that's what we have to do, then we need to be able to help those communities revitalize, become stronger, help those people change their lives, and have a better opportunity for themselves. Without that equity, without giving everyone an equal shot at life and helping them do it, we will not be able to rid ourselves of the scourge of racism. Racism will always be with us. But I believe a better world is possible. And it can begin on the Gulf Coast. It can begin in the Arctic. It can begin in Africa. It can begin anywhere. But we have to have the commitment to want to do it, to not see the differences that make us different as separating us, but making sure that we are all alike and making sure that we are all treated the same and our humanity is respected and we are treated with decency and respect. We can all make it, and that world is possible.
I think that mic is not working. Thank you so much for that powerful intervention, Mr. Beard. And I just want to say, you're reminding us of what Madam Mia Motley said in her intervention, the president of Barbados. She said that all of the wealth that has been generated in the world was generated and created by black people, by brown people, by non-white people, and they don't get a share of any of that wealth that is now being at stake in the debate between are we going to save life or are we going to be keep on the path of profit. So thank you so much for your wisdom. I think we will have like 15 minutes to interact with the panel and hear your reactions, your questions, your comments, and of course expressions of solidarity and how we can try to deal with the bigger problem in the economic system, which is white people. So please go ahead and interact with this amazing panel. Yes, go ahead. Do you want to come to use the mic?
Hi everyone, I'm Rashida, who John was talking about, and I just want to commend all of them for speaking so well, but also want to point out how all three of them are from different places, but if you listen, their story echoed the same subject. And so hoping that when you look around in the room and you see that most of the people in the audience don't look like the three people sitting here, that you actually learned something, took notes, and you're taking it back to your communities so that we are starting to change, because we know that big green groups and all the organizations, we always say that we're for frontline people and we want to help communities, yet we don't do it. We don't start that change. We just listen and then we go home. So I implore each of you to take something from what they said and go back to your communities and evoke change.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? Yes.
Now, I am an old white businessman, and I'm wondering, being here, if it's a good cause of subjecting the human rights and racial discrimination to the climate issue. I think it's worse to have its equal status, and I understand that the overloading of the climate issue and implementing it on all fields, I'm not sure it's serving the cause. I wanted to have your opinion on that. Not only distracting the people of the main issue for which the people have to combat. And I fully understand your fight, but it's a different fight where there are interconnections, certainly. But I would propose that we dissociate it, like a Belgian activist, Anuna de Wever, made a statement saying there are also human rights issues in this country. There are sometimes also in Western countries human rights issues, but don't mix everything, because so you can't really advance. I wanted to have your opinion on that.
Thank you so much. I would just like to remind that we just had a report that says that we need to mix these things. That is the precise core of the report, that they are interrelated, that it is at the heart of the problem, And it's precisely because white people have extracted all of the wealth, the resources, the work, the time in an undermining and even genocidal way, and they have generated the problem. There is actually a statement, I don't know if you know about the overshoot of carbon emission. Is 97% of the overshoot of carbon emission is from developed countries, mostly of white population. And also the 72% of the overshoot of material resource use, which was our colleague is saying about the depletion, is also caused by developed countries, which is mostly white population, and the depletion of that material resource use and biodiversity happens in the global south, which is also mostly about brown and black people. So your question is precisely, I will turn it back to you. Read the report and let us know what are you going to do to help support enhancing that message. Anyone else? Yes?
Also, to what he said, that's also one of the issues that we deal with fighting on the front lines, because we're like, we're on fire, then the white folks are like, but we're burning too. But it doesn't matter, because we're talking about the individual who's burning right now, who's on fire right now. I don't want to come up on the stage because I'll continue to go on, but I'm just saying that's a part of the issue. Like, we're trying to, we have the facts and we have the numbers, but then you have people who say, well, no, forget the facts, this is what we want to do. That's the problem.
Yeah, I want to say in the mic what that colleague said, but is that when brown and black people are highlighting these problems, then there is always one comment in saying, yes, but white people is also suffering for these issues. But she's highlighting how they're coming with the facts, they're coming with all of the knowledge, with all of the figures, and this is a moment in which we need to listen to what has been said all along. So thank you so much for reminding us that. Anyone else?
If you will, let me
Yes,
say
go
something
ahead.
to that to answer his
Go ahead.
question. What is the difference between a little wrong or a big wrong? If something is done to you, if I steal your wallet, or if I steal your name and your identity, which is worse? Which is worse if I take something from you? Stealing from you or stealing from you personally and directly? What I'm trying to say is, regardless of what culture or where it's at, wrong is wrong. Injustice is injustice. Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. No matter the person or their color, it diminishes not only the person that does that it's being done to, the victim, but it also diminishes the person that's doing it because of their mindset and mentality. In order for us to change this, we have to change the perspective of the way we look at each other and how we respect each other's humanity. And a lot of organizations and businesses, while they're in pursuit, a capitalistic pursuit of having money and doing these things, they really don't give back. They don't enhance life. They enhance life for their stock shareholders and employees, but what do they do to the greater bottom line of humanity, especially in these extractive industries? What gives another man the right to take away another man's land and homeland and culture and superimpose his own on it, and then to say, because of where you live, I'm going to extract those minerals and those rights from the very land that you and your ancestors have been on, but you're not going to receive any of the benefits. That's like telling a stock or shareholder, if you own stock or shares in a company, that, well, we're going to keep all the profits, we're just going to use your money to make the money. And that brings up something that I like to talk about all the time in my work. And it comes from a biblical concept, that there's no forgiveness without recompense. Recompense is meaning restore back to those who you've taken something from or injured that which was lost twice over. So if we're going to change this, then there has to be some recompense. There has to be some amendment to be forgiven. We just can't wipe the slate clean and say start from here. That's where structural racism lives at its finest, because it's so built into what we do that it permeates everything. We've got to tear those structures down and reconstruct a society that's fairer and more just, that is equal for what happens in your community just as well as what happens in mine. We may be brothers of a different mother, but we still share a commonality in the fact that injustice for you is the same it is for me. It may be different, but it's still unjust, whether I'm the perpetrator or the victim. It's not right, and it shouldn't happen. No man has a right to oppress another man and to take from him that which he should have. Listen, I'm going to close.
Thank you so much.
My perspective on that is this when we talk about it. You should not want for anyone else anything less than you want for yourself. If it's good enough for you to want it and have it, why shouldn't I have it? Why shouldn't I have those opportunities? Why shouldn't I have a better life? If you can't do that, then you need to take a strong look in the mirror.
Thank you so much. I hear that our two panelists as well want to comment. I'm going to give her to Mishi and then...
Thank you. So I think I will just go back to the report and what is, I earlier said that for so long we have, I think certain races have given themselves the right to knowledge, to articulate, to make theories, and to dictate methodologies and the way in which all of us need to see the world, including seeing ourselves. And I think that part of the fundamental problem that we are seeing right now. The analysis that has been shared in this report, and again, I recommend everyone to read, but it's not a new analysis. It's not the first time that these things have been put together, because as a feminist, for so long, we have said that we believe in intersectionality. We do know that the way the world has been created, number of factors interact. So my gender, my race, my religion, my class, and all that shape my reality and shape how I engage in the position. So it's quite not new analysis that these things have been brought together. It has been there. The only thing is that we never listened to feminists, we never listened to black people, because we didn't consider their knowledge as knowledge, right? And I think that is part of the fundamental problem. And again, if you read the report, there's some things that I think they're fundamental, and I think it speaks to the concern that have been shared. They speak about tech chauvinism and eco-fascism, right? But also they speak on green capitalism and lastly decolonization. And specifically in the decolonization, I think I would like to invite everyone to give themselves a grace of stepping back and do self-analysis. Don't carry the weight of knowing and don't carry the weight of being better than the rest of the world. I think it's just fair to our soul, it's just fair to ourselves to believe and to assume that there's somebody somewhere no better than you. There's somebody somewhere who also needs to have the same opportunity, have the same knowledge as you. So kindly, we really need, if we have to decolonize, is also to take a step back and knowing that the stage and this world belong to the rest of us as well. Thank you.
I was just writing it down so I didn't forget it. I didn't mean any disrespect, sorry. So climate change is a symptom of injustice. Climate change would not be possible without the exploitation of specific populations of people. If we were all treated equitably, fairly, and justly, the colonialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy wouldn't be allowed to exist and create climate change. So all the dysfunctions that we're experiencing with all of the excess carbon in the air, all of that is due to the dysfunction and relationship that we have with one another. In a lot of movement spaces, we talk about how if you want to uplift everyone, you have to uplift the most marginalized populations, because those who are most marginalized will always be most marginalized as we're making that transition. And so if you uplift the person from the bottom, essentially everybody gets lifted to the top. But I just wanted to say that climate change is a symptom of racism. It's a symptom of colonialism. And yeah.
Thank you so much. So grateful for everything that this panel have shared and the solidarity that has been shown in the audience. I think we don't have time So I just want to thank you all for coming, again, recommending the reading of this report. And as one of our panelists was reminding, this is knowledge that has been there for so long, for years, for decades, for centuries, that has been said that. And it's just a matter of opening up and being willing to receive all of the wisdom of all of those voices that so far have not entered the canon or the spaces of so-called knowledge. And now they are coming back to tell us that humanity is at stake, that the life in the planet is at stake, precisely because our reluctance to hear all of the wisdom that was there from the beginning. So thank you so much for joining us, and you have an opportunity to interact with our panelists in here. And thank you again to CL for organizing this amazing event. Thank you.